Good morning, everybody. Hope you are doing well. I just want to preface by saying that I'm recording this video. I have a really, really bad cold. So if you hear me sneezing or, sniffling or coughing or whatever, just, I want to preface by saying I am doing this with a cold right now, so do bear with me. But we are moving on and continuing with our topic of chemical reactions, biochemical, and we are done with photosynthesis with our last video. So now we're going to move on to cellular respiration, and we are going to talk about what cellular respiration looks like, and how energy is made during cellular respiration. We're also going to focus on how much energy is made, so that's going to be an important part of this too. We're hopefully going to finish respiration in this video. It isn't a very long topic, but it is important, so please do pay attention, follow along with your notes, and reach out with any questions you might have, okay? All right, so let's compare real quick aerobic respiration and photosynthesis. Now, first of all, aerobic respiration is cellular respiration. The word aerobic in particular means with oxygen. All right, so if something is aerobic, there is oxygen present. Oxygen present, right? So O2 is available to an organism. So when something is aerobic, there is oxygen available. Very important that we know what aerobic means, all right? Now, just to recap, right, the overall equation for photosynthesis, and this is what we learned in our previous video, is 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus light will give us C6H12O6 plus 6O2. That is photosynthesis. Now we're talking about respiration, right? The overall equation for respiration is C6H12O6 plus 6O2 gives us 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. So if you take a look at these two equations, you will notice that they are opposites of one another. And this is why we were mentioning to you how it's important to memorize photosynthesis, because it will come back here. And if you memorize that one, then you already know this one. You just have to switch it. So in respiration, you have your C6H12O6 and your 6O2, and your that is going to be your reactants, right? So they're your reactants here, which is different than in photosynthesis where it was your products. And then you have your 6CO2 plus 6H2O as your products in photosynthesis, where it was your reactants over here, right? Now, the only difference is that in respiration, you are getting energy, not light energy, right? Not light energy. Remember, in photosynthesis, your light energy is your sun, right? The light from the sun. But here, you're just getting plain old energy. This is going to just simply be ATP. Okay, so that's really the only difference you need to remember between these two things. First difference is that the reaction is flipped, right? So the products in photosynthesis are your reactants in respiration. Your reactants in photosynthesis are your products in respiration. That is your first difference. They are flipped. The second difference is that the energy source is different. In photosynthesis, you get your energy source from the sun as light. But in respiration, you get your energy produced as ATP. Okay, so that's the other difference. All right, so again, the reactants of photosynthesis are the products of respiration and vice versa, like we just said. And therefore, very frequently, scientists will say that photosynthesis is really the opposite reaction of respiration. It is in the sense of it really is flipped, okay? So that's just a quick comparison. You do need to know the formulas for both, but like I said earlier, and like we told you earlier in class, if you know photosynthesis, you know respiration. You just got to flip it, okay? So this is just another quick slide to show you the products and reactants. So what goes into photosynthesis? You have sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. What comes out of photosynthesis? you have glucose and oxygen. What goes into cellular respiration? Glucose and oxygen. And what comes out of cellular respiration? Energy, CO2, water. So if you look, they are, again, opposites, right? They are just flipped. The only difference, again, is that here is energy as ATP, while this energy over here is from sunlight. Okay? So just another chart to help you remember the products and the reactants. But again, you do need to know the formula itself. Okay? Excuse me. All right, so location of cellular respiration. So as we know, for photosynthesis, our location for photosynthesis is going to be in the where? And you should be saying it to yourself now. Make sure you remember it is in the chloroplast, right? Cellular respiration happens in a completely different organelle. It happens in the mitochondria. Please remember that. Cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. This is, again, ATP production, right? We learned when we spoke about organelles that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Mitochondria is the powerhouse. The mitochondria creates energy, right? And creating energy is ATP production. So the actual process, though, is called cellular respiration, which is what we're learning now. So cellular respiration, ATP production, same deal, happens in the mitochondria. Make sure you remember that. Very important. Make sure you know it. All right, so let's talk about the process of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is a very, very complicated process. We are going to simplify it, and we're going to talk about the important stuff, what happens, how much energy is made. All right? So again, very, very complex topic. You are only required to know what we go through here. All right? So cellular respiration will always begin with a process called glycolysis. All right? So this is the first thing you have to know. It always begins with a process called glycolysis. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, excuse me, guys, I'm sorry. If you're thinking to yourself, glycolysis, well, that kind of sounds like glucose, right? That is correct, and that should be what you're thinking. Glycolysis kind of reminds me of glucose, and that would make sense to you because, remember, the reactant for cellular respiration is that, and that is glucose. So glycolysis, right, is the process of breaking down a glucose molecule. That is what it means. So in glycolysis, this glucose molecule up here, right, the C6H12O6, the one glucose that is your reactant, is broken down into pyruvic acid, hydrogen ions, and electrons. So it just gets broken down. Glycolysis itself is a very complicated process, but you don't need to worry about how it happens. All you need to know is that cellular respiration starts with glycolysis. Glycolysis is the process of breaking down a glucose molecule. And when you break down that glucose, you get pyruvic acid, hydrogen, and electrons. Okay? Now, the other thing you need to remember about glycolysis is this, number 2. Actually, I'm going to erase that. Whoops. I'm going to change that to number 3, right? Because the second thing you should remember is what glycolysis is. So the third thing to remember is glycolysis requires the input of 2 ATPs. Input, right, means that 2 ATPs are required to start glycolysis, right? Required to start glycolysis. You need 2 ATPs to start it. You got to put 2 in. Glycolysis creates 4 ATP, okay? So after you have started glycolysis and you break down that one glucose molecule, the result is that you make 4 ATPs. But my question to you now is, and I'm going to challenge you to pause the video for a second and think, if glycolysis creates 4 ATPs, how many ATPs do you end up with? Is it 4? Take a second and think about that. Hopefully you did, and now you're back. The fact is, because glycolysis requires input of 2, and then you create 4, we say that glycolysis nets us. We only net produce 2 ATPs in glycolysis. Our profit is only 2. And that is because we need to use 2 to get glycolysis started. It's like, let's say you won $4 in a lottery. But in order to enter the lottery, you had to pay $2. So you might be winning 4, but you had to pay 2. So in reality, you're only winning 2. That's the same thing here in glycolysis. You're getting 4 ATPs out of it. But in order to start it, you have to give 2 ATPs. So in reality, you only net 2. All right, very important that we understand that. And this right here, I'm blocking some of the words, I know that I am, but take a look at this chart, which is very, very simplistic. You have a glucose molecule, which gets broken down into your pyruvic acid. You see that there's 2 ATPs going into glycolysis, right? And you're going to get 4 ATPs out of it. But again, because you had to put those 2 in, you only net 2 ATP total. Okay? You're only netting 2. So please make sure that you remember everything we spoke about here about glycolysis. Okay? So aerobic respiration. Now, we said in the beginning when we started this unit what aerobic is. Here's a reminder. If oxygen is available, aerobic respiration takes place. Okay? Now, in this case, the next step in cellular respiration after glycolysis is going to be the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. Both of these things are the same. All right, just 2 different names for it. Please make sure you know both names. They are often called either one. I see Krebs cycle a little more frequently. You might see citric acid cycle as well. So just know both. So again, glycolysis happens in cellular respiration always. It's always number 1. The next step depends on if oxygen is available. If oxygen is available, aerobic respiration takes place. Remember, aerobic is yes to O2, oxygen is available. If that happens, the next step is the citric acid or the Krebs cycle. Okay. Now, in this cycle, the pyruvic acid that we made during glycolysis will help produce hydrogen ions, electrons, but most importantly, it helps produce that ATP. So what I need you to remember is glycolysis happens, we do what we do, right? Last slide. Then, if oxygen is available, we go into the citric acid or Krebs cycle. And from there, we make more ATP. So that happens. And then we move to a third function called the electron transport chain. Okay? The electron transport chain. So that is step 3. Okay? ETC. So let's talk about that real quick. You don't really need to know anything, guys, about the citric acid or Krebs cycle. All you need to know is that it's the second step in aerobic respiration. It's the second step in aerobic, right? If oxygen is present, and that it makes ATP. But we don't need to focus on how much or how that happens. The third step is the electron transport chain. Okay? Now, the ETC is very simple. This is what follows the Krebs or citric acid cycle. So we do that. That's step 2. This is step 3. The ETC is super complicated. All I want you to know is that, just as the name sounds, electron transport chain, the ETC bounces electrons around, right? It just moves them around. And by doing that, you create energy. This is the most important part of the ETC. Simply know that ETC creates most of the ATP that we get from respiration. It makes a whopping 34 ATP molecules. So the ETC does the bulk of the job. It makes the most energy, 34 ATP. All right. Now, we are done with aerobic respiration. And to finish off, you just need to remember that with glycolysis and the ETC combined, 36 ATP molecules are created from that one single glucose. So we have the C6H12O6 in cellular respiration, right? That is one glucose. Okay, so that goes through glycolysis. Remember, our net glycolysis, right? Glycolysis gives us 2 ATP net. Okay, and then it goes from glycolysis to Krebs. And then from Krebs, it goes to the ETC. And ETC gives us 34 ATP. If we were to add the 34 plus the 2, that gives us our 36. Okay? And at the end of this video, at the end of this video, there is a chart that I made that simplifies all of this. But I just wanted to give it to you here as well. All right? ETC. All right, so this is a recap. I'm not going to go through this because we spoke about all of this already, but if you want, and I really do encourage you to pause the video, read this, and copy the notes down, you can do that at this point. But I'm going to move on, okay? All right, so anaerobic respiration. So we discussed aerobic, which means that oxygen is present, which means anaerobic should be obvious to you. Anaerobic is there is no oxygen available, right? We don't have oxygen. Oxygen can't be used. So that means anaerobic respiration takes place, also known as fermentation, okay? So if oxygen is not available, anaerobic respiration follows glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis always happens, right? Regardless of the oxygen. Glycolysis is always the first step. When there's oxygen, it then goes to your Krebs or your citric acid and then to the ETC. If there is no oxygen, like we're talking about now, then after glycolysis, anaerobic respiration or fermentation takes place. So what is that? So anaerobic respiration is also simply known as fermentation. And depending on the type of organism, fermentation can occur in one of two ways. Either alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. Now, alcoholic fermentation is simply alcohol gets produced, right? Ethanol. So you produce alcohol, just as the name suggests. And this happens in typically bacteria and yeast cells. Okay? They're able to do alcoholic fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is where lactic acid gets created. This also happens in bacteria, and also, I know that this is cut off, animal cells. So this is where humans and animals can create, can ferment, right? So lactic acid. So two types of fermentation, alcoholic and lactic acid. These are the simple differences. What they make, alcoholic makes alcohol, lactic acid makes lactic acid. Alcoholic happens in bacteria and yeast. Lactic acid happens in some bacteria as well as all humans and animals. Okay? Okay, so alcoholic fermentation. So yeast and bacteria use the alcoholic fermentation process. So this is how things like beer, how things like bread, these things are created, right? They use yeast and bacteria to ferment. I'm sure you've heard of that before. This is literally the process. And it turns it into things like bread as well as beer. Okay, so alcoholic fermentation produces carbon dioxide as well as ethanol. Remember, ethanol is alcohol, right? And that is just a very simple process. We're not getting into details. I just want you to remember who uses alcoholic fermentation, yeast and bacteria, and what the process produces. Carbon dioxide, ethanol also gives us alcohol. It could give us beer. It gives us bread, etc. All right. Lactic acid fermentation, again, I'm going to let you read this on your own, but just a quick recap. Lactic acid fermentation is basically a buildup of lactic acid in your cells. It is a type of acid that builds up in your muscles and builds up in your cells. And this happens when we don't get enough oxygen. So, for example, if you exercise very heavily and you don't breathe in enough oxygen, your cells will eventually go into lactic acid fermentation. This is why you start to cramp up. So if you've ever worked out and you started getting cramps, that's because you don't, if you get cramps or you feel sore, that's because you're not getting enough oxygen into your muscles and your cells, and they start using lactic acid fermentation. And that lactic acid buildup is painful, right? And that gives you that sore feeling, and that gives you your crampy, uncomfortable feeling. So if you ever start to cramp up, stop what you're doing, stretch out, get some more oxygen, take a breather, and then once that subsides, you can go ahead and continue. But that is what that is. So what I just need you to remember very simply about lactic acid fermentation and anaerobic respiration is this right here. Fermentation is very inefficient, much less efficient than aerobic. The entire process only gives you 2 ATP, the whole thing. So from glycolysis through fermentation, you only get 2 ATP. And you should be thinking to yourself, well, how is that possible? Because you get 2 ATP from glycolysis, right? That's absolutely true. You get no ATP from fermentation itself. You don't get any ATP from fermentation. You're only getting the 2 from glycolysis. So it is a very, very ineffective way of getting oxygen and getting energy. You don't want to utilize this if you don't have to. It is a backup method. It is not something that we want to do as humans. It's not efficient, and we can't really live off of this. So eventually it's not going to work for us anymore. All right? So this right here is the last slide, and it is a quick recap of everything that we learned. So I want to go through it with you. So this is cellular respiration broken down very simply. I want you to, of course, remember all the details that we went through, but also know this chart just so you can remember it, okay? So you always start off with glycolysis, right? That is always going to be your first step. You're then going to, and remember, glycolysis creates 2 ATP net, right? It really creates 4 total, but only 2 net. So you get those 2 ATP from there. Glycolysis always happens first. The next step depends on, do we have oxygen or do we not have oxygen? If we have oxygen available, we move into the citric acid and the Krebs cycle. A bunch of stuff happens there that we're not too worried about. And it moves on then to the electron transport chain, ETC. This is where the electrons bounce off of each other and create 34 ATP. You then have your 34 ATP from the ETC, plus the 2 from glycolysis to give you a total of 36. Now, after glycolysis, if you do not have oxygen available, you move into anaerobic respiration, right? That is lactic acid fermentation. Remember, you do not get any ATP, 0 ATP from this. You only end off with your 2 ATP from glycolysis. So again, this is aerobic. This is anaerobic, okay? So this is with oxygen. This is without oxygen. And this is the ATPs you get from each. Aerobic is way more efficient, 36 as opposed to 2. All right, and that is cellular respiration. I know that was a bit, but I wanted to get it done in one video. This is all that we have to talk about as far as respiration is concerned for the moment. So again, please watch this video, ask any questions if you have them, follow along with your notes, and thank you for bearing with me while I'm not feeling so great. All right, guys, have a great rest of your day. Now, if I can figure out how to